Today, we're diving into a really fascinating paradox that comes up in the source material about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and its connection to mental health. And it all boils down to this one central question. How can a single organization be seen in two completely opposite ways? For some, it's a source of psychological harm, but for others, it's a place of incredible human flourishing. So how can both be true? Let's get into it. So on one side, you have this critical narrative that you might have heard. It says the church promotes things like toxic perfectionism and shame. But then you look at the sociological research and it paints a totally different picture. It shows active members often reporting really high levels of life satisfaction, sometimes way above the national average. These two stories just don't seem to line up. So let's try to make sense of this contradictory picture. We're going to start by looking at the data the source material presents, the side of the story that points to high well-being. First things first, let's talk about that well-being data. What is the research cited in our source actually telling us about the psychological health of Latter-day Saints?
Well, the numbers are pretty striking. The source points to multiple studies, including some big ones from the Pew Research Center, that consistently show active Latter-day Saints reporting higher than average happiness and life satisfaction. And that's not just compared to the general population, but to other religious groups too.
And a lot of this research is grounded in a field called positive psychology. It's not about what's wrong with people, it's about what makes them thrive. And the work of Elisa V. Hunter, who's cited a lot in our source, really uses this lens to understand the whole LDS experience. In fact, Hunter's research points to 5 specific things inside the faith that seem to boost this well-being. There's pro-social behavior, service and helping others. There's a huge focus on family, a really clear sense of purpose and meaning, the idea of personal agency or choice. And of course, the health code, the word of wisdom. The source argues that these aren't just random rules. They're practices that build resilience. Okay, so if the data is so positive, then where's that whole critical narrative coming from? Well, our source material has an explanation, and it all comes down to one really important word. And that word is active. According to the source, this is the key. It argues that all those psychological and spiritual benefits, they're really found among the people who are actively, consistently practicing their faith.
The source uses a really powerful analogy to make its point. It kind of frames the church's teachings like a health program. And from that point of view, you can't really expect to get the results if you're not actually following the program.
And just so we're on the same page, active participation isn't some vague idea. It means doing concrete things, praying regularly, going to church, serving other people, and really trying to live the commandments. This is the kind of engagement that the source connects with all those positive outcomes. But what about that big criticism we mentioned earlier, toxic perfectionism? The source takes this on directly, and it does it by drawing a really clear line between what it calls official doctrine and what it calls cultural misinterpretations. So on the one hand, you have the cultural misinterpretation. This is that rigid, shame-filled pressure to be absolutely flawless, right here, right now. But on the other hand is what the source says is the actual doctrine, which is all about a long-term, patient, grace-filled journey of becoming better, over your whole lifetime, not overnight. And to back this up, the material points to church leaders. Like, for example, when President Russell M. Nelson explained that perfection is pending, it's something you're working towards in the future, not something that's demanded of you today. The source argues that this perspective is meant to be hopeful, not shaming. All right, now we get to the final part of the source material, and this is probably its most provocative point. It shifts gears a bit and starts asking questions about causation, specifically about the role of the critical narratives themselves. The source actually uses this pretty intense term, entrepreneurs of doubt, and it uses this phrase to describe people or platforms that it alleges might have some kind of incentive, whether it's financial or ideological, to build a brand around criticizing the institution. And then, the source lays out what it sees as a potential cycle. It starts with real stories of individual pain. But then it claims the church gets framed as the one and only cause of that pain. This kind of narrative, the source argues, can weaken someone's faith, which, for many, is a major coping mechanism. And then, that psychological void that's left, that also gets blamed back on the church. And all of this leads to the final, really challenging question that the source material leaves us with. It asks us to just consider, could it be that some critical narratives are doing more than just observing distress? Could they, maybe unintentionally, actually be contributing to it? Okay, so let's just pull this all together. What are the big takeaways from the source material we looked at today? First, there's this huge paradox between the critical stories you hear and the hard data on well-being. The source tries to solve that paradox by highlighting the difference between active and inactive members. It also makes a big distinction between the official doctrine on perfection and what it calls harmful cultural ideas. And finally, it leaves us with that really provocative question. Are critics just watching from the sidelines, or could they be part of the story itself? It's a lot to think about for sure.